presented to you by Material Innovation Initiative in collaboration with Earthshift Global. I'm Ranjani. I'm the environmental data scientist at MII. Thank you for joining us here today. Today's presentation will focus on Anticipatory LCA, how it supports material innovators. Before the webinar, I would like to give you a brief intro about MII and our awesome speaker for today. MII is a nonprofit accelerating the development of high-performance, animal-free, and environmentally preferred materials. The major outcomes of our work are reports where we see startups pulling information and graphs from and use in their pitch decks to support their story about opportunities and room for growth in the industry. So our four main reports are the brand engagement report, the white space analysis, the state of the industry report, and the EDC white paper. EDC, as some of you might already be members of, is the Environmental Data Coalition. It's the initiative that MII launched last summer. And for this year, what are major findings, the approach we took and the major findings for that are going to become summarized in the white paper. But what it was launched for was that it serves as a platform for stakeholder concerns in data collection, analysis, and reporting. It also identifies gaps, aligns industry efforts, and fosters collaboration to manage stakeholder expectations. Through guidance and best practices, the EDC aims to enhance transparency and uniformity in environmental impact assessment. Our approach includes literature collection, stakeholder interviews, and survey analysis. The past year's efforts, like I mentioned, will be summarized in the upcoming EDC white paper. Now, to introduce our speaker for today, Lisa Lauren is a pioneer in lifecycle assessment and sustainable return on investment, SROI. She founded Earthshift in 2000, which has become a trusted and sought-after sustainability solution provider. Lisa's unique skill set and knowledge base are in demand globally by emergent and established companies, organizations, and governments. Her experience working with companies from various sectors and reviewing LCAs at different technology readiness levels has been vast and deep. And before we go into the presentation, I also want to request all audience to kindly post your Q&As in the comments on the right side of the screen. I think that's where it is on your screen too. And I'll direct your questions to Lisa at the end of the presentation. Thank you. With that, let's start today's webinar you are all waiting for so patiently. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. I want to talk about anticipatory LCA for material innovation. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. I'll start quickly with just an introduction about Earthshift Global, the company that I founded in 2000. We have about 20 folks now. About half of us are analytical services company people. We've got some software folks and then some support folks as well. As Ranjani said, we work with Fortune 500 companies. We work with little companies. We'll work with just about anybody who's interested in making change, which means we get a lot of different opportunities to work with companies like those on the call that are doing material innovation, as well as other product innovation. What I'm going to talk about today is life cycle assessment, but a little bit beyond traditional life cycle assessment. For those of you who aren't familiar with LCA, life cycle assessment looks at the environmental impacts of, we'll use a material today as our example, from raw material extraction all the way through to disposal. And so by looking at that whole stream, we can look at a carbon footprint, for example, a water footprint, and we also look at other impacts throughout the life cycle of a product. When we do comparisons, which we do a lot of the times when we're looking at a new material, because we want to see, is it better than what's come before? What we need to look at is not kilogram per kilogram, right? Because they probably don't work the same kilogram per kilogram. We want to understand what's the function of the product and how can we assess the material based on equivalent function. We'll then model those chains of materials and processes all the way up through manufacture. We call that cradle to gate, and then through the use phase and into end of life. Sometimes for materials, we skip the use phase because there are lots of them. But that's essentially the process with or without the use phase. And then we factor the emissions at each point. So we collect them all, we add them all together, and then we understand how impactful are they. As you know, CO2 is not as impactful as methane, so we're going to look at it that way. If I now look at the innovation process, and you probably have 100 other words for all of these. We might have an opportunity screen to start, and then a concept evaluation. We develop a candidate. We would then pilot and commercialize it. And then we'd have our product and the process to make it. And typically we've had to do our life cycle assessment at this very end stage because we didn't have enough information about the product beforehand. Unfortunately, however, and this is the tricky part, is as you're developing the product, that's when you have the most opportunity to make the changes you need to reduce the impact. This is kind of a conversation I had with Tom Seeger at Arizona State University a while ago. And apparently he had lots of other people who say the biggest thing we need in LCA is to be able to do it earlier in the development cycle. And so anticipatory LCA was really developed to move us up this curve here so that we can start doing life cycle assessment much earlier in the development process. As this says, you know what you're looking at your mature technology, but so you've got a really nice, robust LCA, but you have very little opportunity for improvement, whereas early in the R&D phase, you have much more. So with that, anticipatory LCA was developed in order to look at things further up the chain. And one of the areas that we looked at was social context, right? What do people care about? What are you doing with the material? Is that a good use of a material? So looking at some of the social impacts, some of the social implications actually comes first. And it's a part of LCA that's often not included. But we included it right up front. We have the technological model, which is another place where we need to be able to be a bit flexible. We have impact assessment, which again, we may need to be a little bit flexible to get our LCA results. Sometimes when you're making a new material, you're dealing with a new chemical and you have new emissions and you don't know really what they look like. And so this is a place where we need, again, to apply some anticipatory thinking. We've got some ways of assessing and interpreting the results that are new. I'm going to show you this drawing in a little more detail as it was provided in the initial anticipatory LCA papers and talk a little bit more here about some of this. Okay, we've got some process development and performance evaluation. And then we have traditional LCA stuff going on. Well, what do we have that we might want to consider? Well, we might want to consider that at R&D or even at pilot phase, that we might get some efficiencies of scale as we scale up the manufacturing. So we want to put that in as a scenario analysis. We want to look at other scenario analyses. How is the world changing? Looking at different boundaries that maybe this new product pushes the boundaries a little bit. We also, as I said, look at stakeholder engagement. What are the categories of impact that stakeholders really care about? Greenhouse gases, of course, but are they interested in water? Are they interested in eutrophication or excess nutrients in the water? Looking further at the characterization factor, as I said, sometimes there just aren't characterization factors for nanomaterials, for example. And so we need to have a little bit of extra modeling, perhaps, to model that. And then getting into how do we look at all the metrics that we need to look at and come up with some information that will be useful to people. So in order to do the anticipatory LCA, we need to start with a model that's going to enable us to do that scenario analysis. So we need to be able to model it so that we can model that change in manufacturing as we scale up, right? We might need to look at demand, right? If we have really high demand for our new material, what does that do to end of life, for example? What does that do for, right? Maybe if you have a small demand, you can do some recycling. Maybe if you have a large demand, you can't. How long is the lifespan? Maybe you can't do recycling for a long time. What about the actual advances that are happening in our grid right now? What will that do as our product moves through its cycle? We've talked about scale up and scale up potentially reducing impacts, but we could also look at what are ideas that we get from our first screening LCA that will allow us to reduce impacts. We can look at feasibility. Sometimes the study, and I'll show in a little bit, a study where we didn't, the impacts, basically the product itself wasn't feasible, and we found that through the LCA. And then also that the world is changing and what do people care about. We use trends a lot to predict where we're going. So here's one for batteries, for example. You can see, well, the battery energy density improves, and then it flattens out. It improves, and then it flattens out. If we're talking about lithium-ion battery, how much further out is it going to go before it flattens out? If I have a new battery technology, can I predict something where it's going to improve, and then and improve further than the lithium-ion? Where do we have that flattening out of the curve? And we pull that into the assessment. Here's a different way of looking at trends and looking at if you assume manufacturing energy is tied to price per watt, well, then we have a different trend, watt per kilogram and dollar per watt. When we're doing impact assessment, when we're looking at those bigger trends like global warming as opposed to carbon dioxide, we need to make sure we're including those impact categories of interest to stakeholders. And we want to look at, okay, maybe I've got an emission that I have no idea what how to categorize it, right? We don't know if it is toxic. We don't know if it's going to affect the air, for example. If it goes into the air, is it going to affect our breathing? What are the things that we know? What are things that are like it? Can we use a proxy, something that's like it, to approximate it, at least for now? And we can get toxicology data, for example, and add those factors to our impact assessment. We also pull into this advanced multi-criteria techniques. Trade-offs are something that are tricky in life cycle assessment, that we're looking at multiple impacts, and very seldom are all of them better in the new case, right? Often some are better and some are worse. So we've pulled from the decision-making science, we've pulled the stochastic multi-attribute analysis to look at a different way of looking at trade-offs. And so then we only have to refine data as needed to really see whether one thing is better than another, but also to help inform decision makers through where we are uncertain. So, for example, if I have several impact categories, in this case, I see, and here we're looking at solar cells, I see that the single crystal and multicrystalline silicon all have different impacts from the amorphous silicon and cad telluride. There's a distinct difference there. There's some overlap, but pretty much they're different. Whereas in freshwater eutrophication, even though if I looked at a single number, I'd see different numbers here. Well, essentially, they're indistinguishable, right? And that's important information for a decision maker, right? It may be important from the fact that now they don't go out and tell people that they're much better on freshwater eutrophication when it's indistinguishable. But two, that may be where they want to be, where they want to be equivalent to the current alternative in terms of freshwater eutrophication. So here we can see that they are, even though the numbers might be slightly different, that they're basically indistinguishable. We can then take this distinguishability and look at what is the probability that one will be deemed better than the other, or one will be deemed the best out of multiple alternatives if I look at all the possible value systems that everybody has. So to put these impacts together, right? I'm going to go back here. To put these impacts together, I have to find some way of taking meters cubed of water depletion and kilograms of phosphorus equivalent for freshwater and marine eutrophication and put them into a single metric. Well, in order to do that, I have to either determine whether I care about water depletion more or whether I care about this eutrophication more, excess nutrients more. Or I need to look at it generically in terms of if water depletion was the only thing I cared about versus if eutrophication was the only thing I cared about versus everything in between, right? What does that look like? And that's what we do with stochastic weighting or stochastic multi-attribute analysis. We can also use a range of monetization values with input from literature and stakeholders, and I'll show you what each of those look like. So with this stochastic multi-attribute analysis, and I know this isn't the most beautiful graph, but what we're looking at here are alternative fuels for vehicles, and we're looking at the probability that one of these will have the lowest impact. So you'll see at rank 1 this is the best. Well, gasoline and ethanol are pretty darn low here. And in fact, your EV is going to be most likely to be ranked the best by all the people with all their value systems. Biodiesel is next, and low sulfur diesel is after that. In terms of the worst case, we see that gasoline is definitely most likely to be ranked worse. But look at this, the EV. Oh, sorry, I'm wrong. I'm not looking at that correctly. The gasoline is second. I can't see the EV in there. The biodiesel 100 is the little black bar in the back. So this is stochastic multi-attribute analysis, and it gives us an idea, well, gee, if I'm going to choose between these 5, I think I like the electric vehicle and the biodiesel in spite of all the trade-offs. We can also do something looking at stakeholder values. And here we're looking at A minus B, basically the uncertainty around that if I value something through monetization. So if I look at a very small change in climate change, I will get a very low change. Ecosystem quality, there are stakeholders who don't think there's any value to it and stakeholders who think there's a lot of value to it. So it has a very large uncertainty here and contributes a lot to the total impacts. Here, if I go back and explain this a little better, what I'm looking at here is a probability density on its side and mirror imaged. So I have a best case, a worst case, and then most probable is within the orange. That's 50% probability, and then 90% probability in the lighter color. So here we're looking at the total impact and the benefit in terms of millions of dollars that one option or one alternative might have over the other. So another way of looking at other than this stochastic multi-attribute analysis. So I want to bring this in a little bit to some actual examples, and I'm going to start with a material example so that you get a little bit more of a feel for it. I also want to share that this is an approach. It's not prescriptive. So I don't have to do every piece of this, right? I can do a little bit of it and see how it helps me. So if I want, I can just apply it to the scale up, or I can apply it to scale up plus changes in the grid mix. I don't have to look at everything. This just gives us tools to look at everything. So I'm looking at a bio-based absorbent material. It's ocean biodegradable. The plastics leakage of impacts was not accessible. We couldn't assess that at the time that we did this. So basically we came up with a goal to ensure that all the impacts were at least equivalent to the conventional non-biodegradable absorbent. And so that's what we're looking at here. When we go to the next slide, well, this is, it says textile, it was the absorbent, sorry about that. What we found was the lab scale had higher impacts than the conventional alternative. So what we wanted to do is find out where could we be equivalent, and then look at some of the things that they were developing to see, could they get there? Some of the changes had negative effects, and I'll show you that in a second. But they could add a bunch together and come up with that equivalency. which meant that since they were equivalent on everything else, because it was ocean degradable, it had a lot of environmental benefits over the conventional. So here we go, looking at this again. So here's our baseline. This is the baseline for the new material. The competing technology, so the conventional technology is over here in the gray. Sorry, I'm pointing on the wrong screen here. So the base is here. So this is the initial starting point for the material. Here's the competition. How do they get down to here? So they looked at an alternative feedstock. They looked at what happens with solar energy, moving the location, a scenario 6 that I can't tell you what it is, scenario 6 with solar energy, where now we're basically equivalent. And if I did an uncertainty analysis, I could say these are indistinguishable. And so now if I'm indistinguishable in climate change and all the other impacts, I have this other benefit of being ocean degradable that makes this material a better choice. So LCA can be really useful as part of product innovation, incorporating environmental thinking from the beginning. Even if you don't apply it all, if you think about different aspects of the anticipatory approach from the beginning. Oh, my product uses a lot of electricity. That means over time, the impacts are going to reduce as our grid gets cleaner. So that kind of thinking, bringing that in. Looking at the more optimum conditions, one of the studies that we did, we actually did a matrix. They had done a matrix of assessment looking at the other aspects, the engineering aspects of their material. We did the same matrix in the LCA so they could see, as I move this direction with one of my knobs that I can turn, this is what happens with the environmental impacts. If I turn this other knob, this is what happens. And if I turn a bunch of knobs at the same time, well, this is what happens. So that's a kind of way that you can use it. You can use it to intrigue investors. You don't want to give them a number, but you can say, look, this is where we think we are now, and this is where we think we can get to. And going back to the prior slide, here are the different ways we can get there, and that we don't just have one knob to turn. We have several to turn that'll help us get there. And it also allows us to strengthen our LCA practice by enabling us to look at things from a little bit more of a scenario analysis and less of a my carbon footprint is 10 kind of an analysis. So I recommend that you think about the anticipatory approach even for more mature products. Always looking at where is our energy coming from in the future. Do we have new supply scenarios that we really should be thinking about? Are there co-products coming out of new fuels, for example, that are now bio-based, whereas before they were petroleum-based? What does that look like? Does it make me better or worse? Because your costs are probably going to drive what happens there. You want to look at all kinds of unknowns and simply look at the best case and worst case, right? That's going to give you a lot of information. You don't have to know the exact number. Just instead of doing one analysis, you do two. It doesn't take very long. And usually you can do that all in the same analysis. You can look at what similar technology has in terms of LCA issues, in terms of environmental impacts. Reach out to some of the stakeholders, some of the nonprofits who are interested in these technologies. What are they concerned about? And make sure that your elementary flows, so that substances, if you do LCA, or the elementary flows, make sure they're in your impact assessment method. And if not, if you don't know how to put them in, reach out to some experts. And one of my team thought that this should be bolded because you should reach out to us, but we reach out to somebody else too. This is an area of expertise that we don't have. It's a very specialized area of expertise, but we can help you find somebody if you need it. All along the way, and this is true all through LCA, is reach out to people for help, especially when you get to interpretation. You can learn so much more if you reach out to others outside of your silo. I'm going to pause here for a second and check in with Ranjani and see, would you like me to stop for questions now? Or I've got a couple more examples that I can go into. What would be your preference, Ranjani?
The questions right now, we still haven't gotten any, but I actually had a question. So before
Great.
you proceed, I know that you said there's a design, explorative, and comparative phase that you can take anticipatory LCA and apply it to any of those phases, right? But then when design and exploratory is like your own data, you have some collected data and you use that. But comparative is usually with the product that you said is very similar to your product in terms of use and all of that. But we may not be sure of the data for the product that we're going to compare with. So is it still okay to assume some, like, the uncertainty that you have, maybe because you don't know the conditions the product was developed in? And how do you deal with these data uncertainty? Because for innovators especially, they don't even know where to go to get data.
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, the first thing to do is to jump onto Google Scholar or your favorite research tool and see if you can find a life cycle assessment on the comparative product and start with that. You're looking for something conventional, so you're looking for something on which there probably is some data that you can use. Is it perfect data? Is it the only data? No, there's probably a range around and some uncertainty around that, but it's not going to be as large as the uncertainty around what you are looking at. And it's a good place to start for a benchmark. There's also other ways to look at it, and that is to say, okay, if you're a chemist, you know how this competing product is made. Maybe there's no data on that, but there's data on some other product that is made in a similar way. Use that as your benchmark. And start kind of from there to see where do you need to go. Does that help, Ranjani?
Yeah, that was really helpful. That was really helpful. So I have one more question from the audience. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but anyways, so she says, I had a question about 3D printer example shared in the pre-read. Was the energy used evaluated based on using it for prototyping or for mass production? If this is very detailed, she says, please excuse me. It was included, the details were included. She missed it. You could go back on the slide and probably talk about it.
Yeah, let me go to this. So in terms of the HP Multijet Fusion 3D printer, this printer had just been released. So it was production, if you will, and it was being used for a specific automaker, in fact, to make these parts. So the data for the baseline, the 3D baseline, which is the green line here, came from that production tool. And that's why we really only looked at 20% and 40% less electricity. That was as far as their development team thought they could go. What's really cool is that HP didn't think that energy consumption was going to be a big deal. Because this was based on inkjet technology, and if you compare inkjet to laser printing, inkjet has way less electricity. So that was the farthest thing from their mind. What's really cool is they did start to drive this energy consumption down as soon as they got these screening level results. From the point of view of the injection molding technology, on the other hand, this is obviously production scale. I shouldn't say obviously. I'm sorry. This is production technology, and where we are with the production technology.
So I have one more question. We can proceed after this, and we can come back to other questions at the end of it. So Harsh has a question. How do you define baseline for the LCA? Like, what do you consider as baseline?
That's a good question. And usually what we start off with the baseline is where you are right now, or where you think you are right now. And if you've got a range in there, we kind of set a point where you feel comfortable as this is where we're starting from, and then we'll move from there. Alternatively, if it works better in your organization, you can define the baseline as the competitor, right? That's also a way of defining the baseline, and depending on what we're looking at, we may do that. So again, it's really that comes down to communication. You want to communicate in a way that supports others.
Got it. That's good. Yeah. So the baseline can be anything you feel comfortable starting out with.
Right.
We'll come back to Rebecca's question after at the end of the session. Sorry, Rebecca, you'll have to wait a little bit, but yeah. So you can go ahead.
All right. Let me go back. The next example I have is closer to materials than the 3D printing is. So looking at low greenhouse gas hydrogen from natural gas. So this was a process that created hydrogen from natural gas that did not create carbon dioxide. The lab scale, again, had higher impacts than the conventional. So we wanted to identify where was it equivalent? Could we get to feasibility? And that's essentially what the next step was. And that was really something for the company to do is could they get as far down as they needed to be in terms of energy consumption primarily to get to where they needed to be. They went off and did some more R&D to see if they could get there. And then we assessed again. There were some other things that changed in the process. So we had to make sure that we took those into consideration during the next level of assessment. The same company actually wanted to see if they could take CO2 from coal power plants and combine them with natural gas to create feedstocks. And so they had two functional units. One was to sequester carbon. The other was to create feedstocks. And so we looked at sequestering CO2 from 1 kilowatt hour of coal power. Unfortunately, what we found pretty quickly was that the amount of natural gas that they had to put into this to create the feedstocks to sequester that CO2 was enough to generate 9 kilowatt hours of electricity. And if you're going to take enough natural gas to generate 9 kilowatt hours of electricity and put it into your coal system, you're just going to shut the coal system down and just run the natural gas plant. So basically, it turned out we showed them that it wasn't feasible. Pretty straightforward analysis for us. It was something that they were not able to see directly. All right, we talked about this one a little bit with the dotted line being the injection molding in comparison to the HP 3D printing technology. One thing I didn't talk about here is the uncertainty at different points. So, and this is where the greenhouse gases are not distinguishable, right? So at 1,500 parts, you couldn't tell the difference between the injection molding and where we were at that point with the HP 3D. And after that, we could see that the injection molding was better. So making more parts, I was better doing injection molding. As we dropped the electricity, that point moved up to 3,000 parts, which actually thrilled HP at the time. They really were focusing this tool on low production, so niche products and low production, higher than one-off, but lower than mass production. We also looked at what would happen at different numbers of parts using different energy sources. So what if we looked at it in the US, in Europe, because they're selling into both markets. Okay, well, it looks better in Europe. And gee, if you use wind power, which some of their customers are using 100% alternative fuel, well, now it's even much lower. Another thing we looked at, and Ranjani, please jump in and stop me if when it's the right time to jump off here.
You have a few minutes, so go ahead.
Okay, all right. So this is a study we did with Sandia National Labs. It was actually a precursor to Anticipatory LCA. They were looking at primary data from algae grown for the supplements industry. And they wanted to see, well, what if we use those data to understand what algae biodiesel would look like? And so we got this primary data from this small production area. And again, the results looked terrible. And the folks from Sandia said, this looks awful. I can't take this to anybody. I said, well, wait a minute. This is not what it's going to look like if you scale this up. This is just a little tiny production facility. If you're going to do biodiesel, you're going to do a lot of this. You're going to scale this up big time. They were looking at putting these ponds next to fossil fuel electricity plants, grab the CO2 right from there to feed the algae. So we looked at scaling the pond sizes. We looked at scaling paddle wheels. So there's paddle wheels in these ponds that move the water and the algae around. And so we scaled that and then actually scaled the efficiency up as well, because the bigger the paddle wheel, the more efficient it is. And so we looked at a little bit of an improvement there. Same thing with the centrifuge. And so we looked at a bunch of different scenarios. We have, with current assumptions, we're looking at a global warming potential of 0.18. And so that's 0.18 kilogram per kilogram, I believe. If I put in, so that algae farm was in the Middle East. What happened if I put it in with US electricity? Well, it got a lot worse. I looked at a different method within life cycle assessment. I come up with the same results, so that's a good thing. That's based on choice, so my choice doesn't matter. If I change the centrifuge energy, I drop it, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. What about increasing the paddle wheel energy? Well, that makes it worse. A different filter No difference, really. What if I change the algae oil to biomass ratio? Oh, this makes a big difference. And this was an area that change has been made and could be made. And then a different one, if I go the opposite direction, it makes it worse. So yeah, so that's another example. And so now I'm going to turn it back to you for questions, Ranjani.
Thank you, Lise. That was really informative. And I think you gave great examples on how to sort of consider yourself as an innovator to making a product for your reason, like your purpose, but at the same time, be innovative about how you can design it. And that's why, like you said, it's very important to start adopting LCA in the earlier phases and then keep changing as you go. So there are like a couple of good questions on this. As innovators, they're always constrained on time and budget. So that's one thing. So how much time do you recommend, like Rebecca is asking, and the cost that you spend on a basic assessment when you start out your design or your explorative stages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to say that it really depends on how complicated your process is, and also your goals, right? Are your goals small? You have a bio-based material and you just want to be equivalent, or you really want to change an entire industry and drop the impacts by an order of magnitude, right? The first one, well, maybe you do a fairly high level screening study, which might be 40 hours, right? It might be, if you contracted, it might be $15,000 to $20,000. You might do a more extensive study. What I always recommend is you do your first LCA on the easy information to find. And then what's not easy, put in a proxy, put in a big high proxy. If it just show up in your analysis, if your analysis says that's not the direction to go, then find out what's important in there. And that's where you go get more data. That's where you start refining. And so do it with the least amount of data you can. Just do a very high screening and see where you are and see where you need to go and what it tells you. Just keep in mind, okay, I missed this. I did a high impact on this one. No, this is where I am. But this is what it's telling me. It's telling me, oh, that thing I put the high impact, the high proxy in for, it's showing up. So that's important, right? That material is important and the impact of that material is important. Let's go find out what it is, what it really is, and then see if we can reduce it. But if it's not showing up, let's go elsewhere. If it's the energy, then let's focus on the energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And I have another question from Aditi Murthy. She says, how often do companies reevaluate LCAs through the process of designing and innovating new technology or materials?
That's a great question again. And it depends on whether or not they have either assessment capability in-house or their innovation pathway was streamlined enough that they could have some metrics that they could tweak and in like a simple model. If they can tweak things in a simple model or they have LCA in-house, either of those are going to allow them to check more often, right? If they're off doing it on their own, contracting it outside, then the timing from one to the next can be 2 years. It can be 5 years. The 5 years is actually a fairly I can say I've had a number of folks come back to us 5 years later to go again. They're at that point, they've done a whole bunch of things that now they feel like they can go public and they want to do a more rigorous study. We have had folks come back, they've done a few things, and in a couple of years, they've wanted to do the same thing.
That's great. Yeah, it does take a lot of time to innovate, and on top of that, you have to keep track of what you've been innovating to make changes at the right stages too. So, yeah, I can totally understand. 5 years is probably a good amount of time. And
Yeah, one thing I would recommend too is whether you do it in-house or whether you're doing it externally, doing an LCA is expensive. It's resource intensive. You're doing a lot of work. So make sure that you get the most you can out of it, right? If you've got 5 different improvement scenarios that you're thinking about, don't analyze 3 of them, analyze all 5 of them while you have the manpower, the brain power thinking about it, because to come back and do the other 2 later is going to cost you twice as much, at least, as it did if you did it the first time. So that's the other piece. If you look at all kinds of different scenarios, then you're less likely to need to spend that serious effort to do a big study again later. Then you can wait.
That's a great
too.
Yeah, that's a great tip that, when you're going at it, just go fully. Don't just restrict yourself. The other thing is that you're talking about cost as for the 5-year term, or for is it like, you can just do it for 6 months for now, complete what you're doing, because sometimes you don't even have an idea of what changes you're going to make. You just want to make sure that your product is the best, but for now all you can do is just one raw material change. But then maybe in a year or 2 years from now, the raw material itself might be something like, for example, you get bioplastics now, and you completely want to replace your synthetic material in your product, and 2 years from now you have a great product. So is it okay to just stop at 6 months, try different ideas, and again come back with totally different products? Like it's going to be like intermittent rather than continuous then.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You can do that. Again, the more you can do at one time, the less expensive it's going to be, the less resource intensive it's going to be, whether you're doing it internally or externally. Yeah. So if you can hold that first one off a little bit and pull the second one in a little bit, then you're better off.
Talking about expertise, you explained a lot about stochastic modeling, and but a lot of innovators probably have no idea where to start with that, like the stochastic modeling, and what are options they need to consider and what are their parameters, and they might need expert advice from people like you or Chief Global experts. So when do you recommend them to come to you than doing things by themselves? Because sometimes you think that you have the expertise and you start doing things and you may not even know where you're going wrong. But when do you recommend innovators to go to consultants if they don't have the experience?
So I would say if they don't have experience, but they have good LCA experience, then when they get stuck, then find an LCA expert. And we do coaching, but there are also university professors who are available to coach you, to look at your model or answer your question, or help you interpret what the results look like. If you're looking for the stochastic multi-attribute analysis, we have a tool that I can grab your data, put it in, and give you the results. It doesn't take too much. And we will have a tool publicly available sometime next year.
That's great. So you'll have an anticipatory LCA tool next year. Oh, that is awesome. That is good to hear.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so that's the one time I would suggest that you think about seriously about going externally, even if you have an internal team, is when you're ready to go to market and you have the status quo, if you will, the competitor that you're hoping to replace. If they like to have lawsuits, then I would say it's worth the money to go externally, get a really good, solid study done that has no pretense of having bias in it, and that way, if the lawsuit comes, you're covered and it'll go away very quickly.
Yeah, that is much needed, because these days you have to have enough proof to say whatever you've done is right. So coming to that, do you know if there's a range for anticipatory LCA costs? Like, this is might be the minimum to the maximum something, because just to get an idea of what they need to budget in for, or is it just, it says it depends, like most LCA questions?
It depends. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could do a very quick study in an hour on a web meeting that would be $300, or I can do, or we could do something, and that's for us at least. And I can't speak for other consultants on this, but tell us your budget.
Okay,
And
that's
tell you
what
what we can do for that.
that's nice. Yeah, that's another way to approach, the material innovator can think about it. Like, I only have this much money and I can only do this much. So that's a great thought. Yeah,
And
thank you,
especially
Lisa.
for startups.
Yeah. If we don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much. This was very valuable. And I think it gave a great idea of what exactly we need to do in anticipatory LCA. Yes, the slides will be made available. Someone had a question about that. Lise can share the slides. And actually, this session has been recorded. So we will give the recording rather than the slides themselves. You can go through the slides through the recording. Thank you so much again. And I'm going to wrap up. And Camilla, yes. So as you know, MII is a nonprofit, and these sessions are only made possible through our collaborations with external consultants like Lise and Achieve Global. So we at MII serve as a vital nexus and unite material companies, scientists, entrepreneurs, brands, and investors by facilitating connections, sharing knowledge, and championing science and innovation. We are nurturing a dynamic global marketplace for next-gen materials. Our focus spans from the realm of fashion, automotive, and home goods industry, driving progress and transforming possibilities. So please, we request you to join us in shaping the future of materials together, empower the future with your generosity, MIIs, and we want to make sure that MII's impactful endeavors thrive through your support of philanthropy, foundations, corporate partnerships, sponsors, and however you want to join us. So with that, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to you all for being here today, and it shows your unwavering interest and support, and that we deeply appreciate. And also, if you want to contact us for your questions, or you'd like to know more about MII and the EDC initiative, please write to us at edc@materialinnovation.org and Ranjani and materialinnovation.org. Thank you also to Achieve Global and our esteemed speaker, Lisa,
Thank you,
for
Anthony.
sharing your knowledge, insights, and time for today's webinar. Your expertise and perspective have added really immense value to our discussions. We truly appreciate your contribution.
Thank you,
And I'd
Ranjani.
like to invite everyone to join us for the second part of the webinar series, the LCA webinar series, which focuses on best practices for communicating sustainability-based innovation by Karen Fleming. She's the Chief Marketing Officer at Earthshift Global again. And we'll see you then. Thank you again.